Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community, is brought to you by Handy Quilter, designed by a quilter for quilters, and Husqvarna Viking, keeping the world sewing for over 140 years. Hi, and welcome to Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community. I'm Mary Kate Karr-Petras, and I'm here today for a really fun episode, actually the first of two parts, and I'm here today with Barb Eikmeier and Donna Lynn, and they are here to talk to us about the last 4 decades or so of quilting, which is when you all started quilting in the 70s, right? And this is a presentation that you give.
We do. We give it together. It's a lot of fun.
And we had a version of your presentation in our August-September issue. So, but this is going to be really fun to see the actual artifact. And we brought a lot of stuff. Yes,
we brought a lot of stuff. There's so much stuff that we decided to kind of divide it into 4 sections. So we'll be talking about tools, techniques, publications, and the social aspects of quilting. So
for each decade.
For each decade.
And we're starting here in the very groovy 70s.
You can see these are some of the fabrics that were available in the 70s, and they're quite different from what we have nowadays.
Yes.
Although you do see some things coming back again, which is,
yeah, but as we were noting, I mean, just the feel is quite different.
The hand is what we have nowadays is just so far superior.
Yes.
But
I think I had a jumper out of that fabric.
That's so fun, though. This is a print you might see these days, but as we were saying, in a higher quality fabric.
Very different. So anyway, but this is...
Yeah, this is my first quilt. It's kind of bold of me to bring it out
No,
today.
I feel like every first quilt deserves some applause.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. It was 1976 when I made this, and I saw it actually in one of my mom's magazines, and sketched it out. Look at that. That's something. That's the original. That's how we did them back in the 70s. The fabrics are all polyester, so they haven't faded, not one bit.
No.
Very brilliant still today.
And did you get a lot of use out of this?
Oh,
yeah.
I sure did.
Do you still
The
use
batting
it?
has all shifted. No, we don't get it out much nowadays.
Okay, all right. Well, now it's vintage. It's, you want to preserve it at this point.
That's right.
So,
Well, this is my very first quilt. I made this in 1975. I made a lot of clothes in the 60s and early 70s. And so this quilt was made for this very awful young man who I couldn't stand all summer, and then he asked me out on a date, and I actually liked him. So he needed something and I didn't have any money, so I had all these home ec scraps. And I had a picture of a Dresden plate quilt. And so I got the wedge, and I just cut all my old home ec scraps from the late 60s and early 70s into these wedges and sewed them together. And then I appliqued them kind of, sort of, you can see I zigzagged them onto polyester denim. And then I wanted it to be really warm, so it has 2 extra loft polyester bats in here.
what is it about first quilts that we think that we have to put in 2 layers of batting? I did the same thing with cotton batting.
Because a quilt is supposed to be warm.
It's supposed to be fluffy and warm, yeah. But this thing is so flat now. You can see when you handle it how flat it's gotten. But then I put polyester denim on the back too, and it weighs a ton. And I gave it to him, and I did end up marrying him, and we still have this thing. But mostly the kids played with it.
Okay.
So, but
Those are all dressmaking scraps.
yes, all dressmaking scraps. And what's really horrible is that I actually wore these things. So
Again, some of those definitely, I could see them back in the stores these days, that's for sure.
So that one was made by machine, and then I learned that you were supposed to actually do it by hand. And so I went back, and I'll show you a little bit later the books, the book that the first quilt came from, and then the book I used to teach myself how to hand piece and hand quilt. So I went and made this, and these are some cotton calicos from the 70s.
Yep.
But then this is a lining fabric for clothing. So it's a polyester. And so it's all mixed together.
I never knew that.
Yeah. I couldn't find anything that I wanted in the sashings.
But you certainly wanted brown, didn't you?
Well, that's all that was available. and this was actually in a PX in Germany in the late 70s. And so, but it's hand quilted, and simply teaching myself. You run into a problem, try to figure out a solution, and go on
We
from
should
there.
show some of the tools that we used back in those days.
Yes, and the ways we
Fantastic.
did things way back when.
Well, we will. We're going to come back in just a second and showing some of those tools that we were just talking about. And we're back to talk about tools and techniques and books and all of this other stuff.
Well, the hallmark of the 70s was that it was still very traditional. We had books. There weren't many, but they looked like this. And the instructions were complete, but they were teaching hand piecing for the most part. There was probably a little bit of machine piecing, but the focus really was on hand.
Which means templates.
Which means templates. And so we would have to draft our own patterns. We'd have to draft our own pattern pieces, and we just use the tools that were available. And then we'd make our templates from what we could find around the house. I mean, these are actual templates of mine made out of notebook paper. And here's cardstock. You could use sandpaper if you wanted it to be a little grippy, and cardboard. Sometimes if you had a piece of plastic, like the lid of a Crisco shortening can, you could make a template from that. So that was, the way we did things, and we would hand piece, with needle and thread and nothing special, just what we would get our dressmaking supplies from your local regular, ordinary fabric store.
Or tools you had around the house.
Anything we had around the house.
Needles, just whatever you had on hand. Thread, the same thread that you used for dressmaking. And so everything, the piecing was done by hand and the quilting was done by hand, and that was the real way to quilt.
Yes, you didn't do it by machine.
So just using the stuff that you had from your dressmaking supplies basically was how quilting started. And in the 70s, Barbara Brackman produced her Encyclopedia of Patchwork Patterns. And so that became a resource for quilters to find patterns. And they were just little drawings, but everybody knew how to draft.
Yes.
So they could draw their own. They could draw their own patterns from them because they were learning that from the beginning.
It's a great resource. We still use it around here.
We do, yes.
We do too.
Quilters Newsletter premiered. This is its #1 issue right here, and so it was. It's dated 1969, 1970. So that's a beginning.
Yes,
that's a beginning right there. By 1974, they had produced their first 4-color cover, and it's amazing to me to think about this, but by 1978, March 1978, they produced issue #100.
Yes.
And so the quilters were meeting at church basements and quilting bees. There were some community ed centers that were teaching quilting during the 70s, but it was quilt shops were few and far between, so the community aspects of it were these small bee kind of formats.
Right, very community-based.
Very traditional, a lot of tradition. Things were still done the way they had been done. So it was very, I still loved it.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the quilting bug bit anyway.
Yes, yes. And then it propelled, things really started to pick up as things went into the 80s.
Yeah.
Yes.
So let's take a look at the next decade, the 1980s. Well, if you couldn't tell from the color scheme in front of us here, we are solidly in the 80s now with this blue and mauve.
Blue and mauve, yes. And the traditional, schoolhouse alternating with just a single chain block, and just very, very 80s. But the guilty thing about this is it was machine quilted.
Well, it was gaining more acceptance.
It was starting to come into acceptance, but still didn't feel quite right.
This was my first applique quilt. My son was born in 1986, so that dates this quilt. And you can see still using a lot of the calico prints. It was made from a purchased pattern, so we were starting to see a lot more purchased quilting patterns coming out. And whereas we were using notebook paper in the 70s, we were starting to see template materials come out. I worked as a nurse, and so I had access to exposed X-ray film.
You were everybody's best friend.
I had heard about X-ray film.
Yeah, all the quilters liked me.
Oh, yes, you wanted to know a nurse.
It's very cute.
And then this is homespuns mixed with calicos, machine pieced, and then hand appliqued. Donna actually made this one.
Hand quilted.
Hand quilted.
Very nice.
And again, this was like 1985, I think it was. But again, you could see those blues and pinks and the little pin dots. And this is hand pieced and hand quilted. And in fact, this is we now had acrylic template plastic. We still had to mark everything and cut it out, and it was still marked with onto the fabric with the templates.
Didn't need a nurse.
But didn't need a nurse anymore. We could. This was mid 80s. We could now do things without having to know a nurse. And again, in the 80s, there was a revival for Amish-style quilts, and solids were very popular. Yes. But the solids kind of disappeared after that. We didn't see too much of them again. But again, this is a pattern I was self-publishing back then. You can see 1987. This was machine pieced and still hand quilted, though. So.
We'll take a break and then come back and talk about other self-publications during the 80s.
Very good. And as you can see here, clearly the 80s saw a big profusion in the availability of different types of tools available to quilters. Like, things changed pretty rapidly.
It was a transitional decade. It was a great time to be a quilter because every day it seemed there was a new idea exploding.
There sure was. I actually made my first quilt in 1976, but I didn't start quilting for real, I guess you could say for real, until 1984. And so I was just coming in when all this stuff was becoming available. And initially it was still hand piecing and hand hand quilting. And so the tools kind of reflected that. But people wanted to start learning machine techniques, and so how could we add the seam allowance to our pieces? And so all kinds of tools about adding seam allowances were coming on the market. Great new tools for making our quilting easier, and custom thimbles and like leather thimbles. All these kinds of tools were coming on the market. But people were still doing cutting with scissors. Books became kind of specialty techniques and specialty patterns. So this one you can see from here, this was all done with scissors, and the template had little notches on it. So this preceded the rotary cutter.
Yeah.
In fact, you would tear your strips in some cases and sew them into strip sets, and then you use those scissors to cut what we would call segments nowadays.
Yeah, the quilters who had been doing it were doing that. I didn't learn to tear, but I heard about that.
And even using paper cutters. If you had a really good sharp paper cutter, you could cut your strips that way as well.
Oh, neat.
So in fact,
when did the rotary cutter come in then?
it was actually introduced in 1979 for the garment industry, but it didn't really start to creep into broad use until the mid-'80s with quilters.
It was there when I came on board.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and that's what really changed everything.
Mm-hmm.
But there's some of us were just starting to self-publish. This is Sally Schneider's, and she was doing quick piecing
With the rotary cutter?
with a rotary cutter and machine
Mm-hmm.
piecing. This is my very first one, and in it I'm telling people, if you have a rotary cutter, you can use it. If you don't, you can still tear your strips.
Mm-hmm.
And this is when I first addressed the idea of an accurate quarter-inch seam allowance, because we really started to become aware of that when you switched to machine piecing.
Right.
So it made a huge difference. But the rotary mat didn't have lines on it when it first came out. We had these just basic cutters, but we started to see new tools, and we started to see new techniques. And this was a method in the 80s where you drew a grid on your fabric and sewed to either side of a diagonal line to create these half-square triangle units. And we'll see this idea transform in future decades. But this little board here just shows all kinds of strip piecing techniques that we were starting to learn, and even bias strip piecing, chain sewing, all kinds of new ideas that just exploded at the end of the 80s. I mean, I was working at a shop, and it was just so exciting because every day there was something new that you were learning. A customer would come in and say, "Wow, did you hear about this?" And books were just really starting to proliferate. Martingale, that Patchwork Place was really starting to take off. Nancy and Dan Martin with their publisher, and others as well. And it was just such an exciting time.
And quilt shops were sprouting up,
Yes.
and
Yes.
quilt guilds were expanding. There was still the quilt groups meeting in the church basements, but you started seeing a lot more sharing going on between the quilters through these organizations. The National Quilting Association was growing.
Yes.
And, of course, Quilters Newsletter magazine was still there.
Sure were.
So there's a 1983 issue. I always loved that issue for some reason. Quilting tools did you ever know about this? The Q-snap?
I've seen frames like that.
Yeah, it was for lap quilting, and Georgia Bonestill was publishing, and she had a TV series
I
about
know
her
that
lap
TV series,
quilting.
yes.
Lap quilting with Georgia Bonestill, and she was teaching quilters how to do machine piecing and then quilting by hand. So
Yes.
combination techniques were starting to come about. Harriet Hargrave published her first machine quilting book, and as quilters started to learn heirloom machine quilting, things really started changing in the quilting world. In 1989, to kind of close out the 80s, Best of Show in one of the big national quilt shows with a machine quilted quilt. And so that was kind of like opening the doors to quilters.
And that was very controversial,
Yes.
from what I understand. People were not
It wasn't
happy.
real because
Some
it wasn't
people
by
were not
hand.
happy, yes.
But there were people on both sides of the issue who were passionate.
Yeah,
Both
yeah,
sides.
yeah.
It was amazing.
Yeah.
It was. And then we started seeing categories come in quilt shows after that. We'll talk about that more when we get to the
Yes,
90s,
we
the
will.
real 90s.
Yes. Well, be sure to come back and join us for the second part of this episode, where we will talk about the 1990s and the aughts, and a little bit into our current decade as we continue tracking changes in technology, tools, and publications in quilting. Thanks so much for joining us, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye. Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community, is brought to you by Handy Quilter, designed by a quilter for quilters, and Husqvarna Viking, keeping the world sewing for over 140 years.